Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'm going to be pruning my willow trees again. This is something I do every year, and I always do a yearly update on my YouTube channel, so you can have a look back and see all the different years that I've been pruning the willows. So the willows here, these are hybrid willows, so they grow incredibly fast. I prune these every single year, but what I do is I prune every other tree. The reason being is I used to cut every tree every year and it would grow up to this height every summer, but the problem was that in the winter time we didn't have any windbreak and the wind would come in. And the main thing about these willows is I'm growing them as a windbreak to protect the garden because we get very strong winds here. So what I do now is every other tree, that way we don't lose all the windbreak at once and we're going to have some protection over winter. So I'll go through every other, get some quite big limbs off here, very useful for supports in the garden and things like that. Now the one that I do every year is the willow arches. There's two of them, so you can see here got a willow arch up here, and this is cut every year, so you can see how fast this grows. And then down the end we've also got another willow arch right down the bottom there as well, quite a wide one. So as you can see, there's lots to cut, and the way I do it is I just use my pruning saw, and I'll just go through now and I'll prune every other willow, and I'll show you the progress as I go along. So I've just cut some off the first tree, and I've been quite surprised at quite how large they are. So I thought I'd better give you an update on how these have been growing over the last year. And I think last summer has really helped the willows out quite a lot. So the last few years, last 5 years or so, we've been getting quite dry, drought-like conditions around May or June time. That's been slowing down the growth of the willow, because that's normally when the willow will be growing its fastest. Here in this garden we have a high water table in the winter, but it really does go quite low in the summer. And we have very sandy soil, so the soil dries out quite quickly. So in the summertime, we find that when it comes to about June, July time, sometimes the growth does slow down when it gets very dry. This year, however, we started getting some dry weather in June, and then the rest of the summer was very wet. So I think last summer has really helped this to grow extra fast. You can see that with how long the shoots are on the willow archways. Also, the stems on some of these more mature plants, which are only 2 years old, are much thicker than they have been in previous years. So for 2 years of growth, that's remarkably thick, that stem. So it does look like we've had some really good growth. Also, what I've been doing for the last couple of years is I've been thinning out the branches. So in the past, when I used to cut them, I used to let all the shoots grow up. Now I'm reducing it down to about 5 or 7 shoots on each plant. The reason for that is because lots of really small thin branches aren't very useful for us, but those thicker, longer branches definitely are, because we can use them for support around the garden. So we've been trying to go for longer, thicker stems, less congested. Also, I'm trying to encourage a more height to the growth. These get really thick and congested in the summertime, so we want to keep the numbers down on the stems, but we want to get that height. So with having less stems, each individual stem is going to grow taller, and then we're going to get more wind protection that way. So what I'll do now as well is I'll just give you a close-up of one of the trees, and I'll show you how I go about pruning it and what I'm looking for when I'm pruning. So I'm going to use these willows here as an example of how I prune my willows. So you'll be able to see quite easily the difference between the 1 year of growth and 2 years of growth. So in the first year, the trees look like this, the first year after pruning anyway. They have these thin branches, and there's not many side branches on these either. And then the second year, what happens is they really thicken up. They don't gain much more height, but they do get a lot more thickness, and they grow lots of side branches. So when pruning this, for example, these trees will be left this year. I'm not going to cut these at all. And then I'll be cutting these ones, and I'll just show you now how I go ahead with that. So all I do is I get my pruning saw, and when it comes to pruning, I always prune back to the position it was growing from last year. What we decided with this, instead of having a coppice down to the ground level, we have a pollard. The reason I'd go for a pollard is it's just much easier to maintain, and you get that extra 1 meter of height advantage when it gets going. I found a ground level coppice, it's just a lot more work. You had to go on your hands and knees, or you're bending over, that's a lot more difficult. If we had a pollard that was up at 2 meters in height, again, that would be quite hard to reach, more difficult, but I just find around about a meter, certainly for me anyway, is a perfect height. Makes it much easier for me to do this every year. And as there's hundreds of willow stakes that need to be cut every year, anything to make my life easier is an advantage. So here we are, ready to cut this one. So first of all, I'm going to do an undercut. So I'm going to see where about I'm going to cut this to. It's going to be about this height here. I want to do an undercut. An undercut is on the lower side of the branch, so this branch is leaning this way. As I'm cutting it, the gravity is going to pull it down. If I was to cut mostly on the underside, it would trap my saw very quickly. But the reason I want to cut a little bit here is because that will break the bark. If I just cut this without the undercut, just cutting from the top, what would happen is it would rip, and it would rip the bark, and that would leave a big scar and it wouldn't heal nicely. What you want to do is cut it nice and close to where it started to grow from. That way it will seal over nicely and not get a scar. So I'm just going to go ahead, find the right position, and then I'm just going to saw in just a little bit like that to get my undercut. Now I can't get access to this one yet, so first of all I'm going to have to cut this branch off. Now with these branches, if they're quite light and you can take the weight, you can actually skip the undercut process, but generally I will undercut most of these if I can, and only not undercut if I'm struggling to get access, or if I can completely hold the weight of the branch so that I can take it off without it trapping the blade. So now that one's out of the way, we can get access to this one. So I just want to line up this new cut from the top side so it's going to match the undercut, so that it's a nice clean cut and it's not staggered. And then going to take some of the weight, because this is right above the camera and I don't want this to crash into the camera. Also, there's a small chance it could still break off early and the undercut might not do its job. So I want to make sure it's supported. For a very heavy branch though, and with a good undercut, I can cut that off without supporting it. So you can see there, I've not matched the undercut perfectly with the uppercut. So what I'm going to do is just go through this again and just cut a little bit more off so I can get a nice flush cut. There we are, nice flush clean cut. You can see in the past here, I've gone a little bit too high on these ones. These have just died off and they haven't sealed over. What I'm wanting is a lower down cut so it seals up nicely and we're not going to have those issues. So what I'm going to do now is continue. So these smaller ones again, no need for an undercut. I can just cut them off by hand. We've also got something growing up from the base here, so I'm just going to take that out down to the ground level and then continue on with my pruning. So once I've done the first pass doing all the second year growth, I'm then going to look at these plants that have just had the 1 year's growth. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take out right down to the base any of these younger, smaller shoots with secateurs, because I'm wanting to thin these down. These small ones aren't going to come to anything. I want all the energy and growth focused on the larger branches so I can get those more useful branches. So these are going to be cut out completely. I'm then going to have a look, make sure there's none that are rubbing, take any rubbing branches out. I'm also going to look and make sure that any branches that are coming out really low down and starting to shade other parts of the garden are going to be taken out. So this one here, for example, it's not a very tall branch. Also, it's kind of hanging right over the garden path. So I'll be taking that one out, but I'll be leaving the one next to it because the one next to it is in a good position. So I'll just carefully take that one out like that. So that's basically most of the process I'll be going through of this pruning. And what will happen is these ones that have been thinned out will have the space they need to grow, and they'll look a lot more like these ones at the back here with the much thicker branches just next year. And they'll have some nice big thick sturdy branches that we can use for garden supports, or we can also use them as firewood as well. So that's the willow all now pruned, so that's every other one completely pruned, and the first year growth has been thinned out. So as you can see, we've got a huge amount of cuttings that have been taken out, loads of material. This is how much we take out every year. As I say, there is also the willow arches to do as well, so there'll be a lot more coming down soon. So this material we tend to use more for very strong supports in the garden, or we use as firewood because it's much thicker and it's not as flexible. And then the other material that will come down will be the ones from the willow arches. As that is 1 year's growth, it's a lot thinner and it's also a lot more flexible. So that we tend to use for obelisks or smaller supports for lighter plants, or if you want to do any kind of weaving as well. Now, normally what I do with these willow archways is I train in 1 or 2 new branches and cut all the other ones off. This year I think I'm just going to try and focus on cutting them all off. I know every year I say I'm going to cut them off and I'm not going to weave any new ones in, but it's always so tempting to weave a new one in because it looks so nice. This year I'm going to try and be more strict because they have got a lot of material in them. This one isn't too bad. There's a fair bit of material getting a bit congested in the middle, but as I say, it is a nice tight arch. The other one down the side here is a different story though. This one I've got a different style as well, because the idea of this one is it's nice and tight on one side and it's loose on the other. But you can see in the middle here, there's a lot of congested material. I don't really want to weave much more in there as it will look a bit too congested. But the idea of this one was always, it starts off loose on the right and as it goes over, it gets tighter. So that's the idea with that anyway. So I'll go ahead now and I'll start pruning out these willow arches. As I say, this year, trying not to weave anything new in, just stick with what I've got and just cut off to the base where it started to grow from last year. There's a lot of material on these willow arches. It's surprising how much actually grows off of this. So there will be a lot more. As I say, a huge amount of material. You can see how much we get every year. So that's the willows now all pruned, as you can see, including the archways. So there's all the material on the other side, and then from this side is where I put all the archway material. So you can see even the archways themselves, a lot of material has come off of them. Now when it comes to the height, I always like to measure the tallest amount of growth in 1 year. This year we didn't break any records. The record for me was 4.60 meters. This year it was 4.40 meters, so not far off. It always seems to be about 4.40 meters, I find, with this. Certainly with this central archway here, that tends to have the longest growth. So I'll show you the longest one. It's this one down here. Now, the fact it's slightly curved, and because I didn't cut it off at the very base because of where it was a bit congested. So you can probably add an extra 5 centimeters to the total growth. But basically it's 4.40 meters. Or at least that's what I'm going with the measurement this year, even though technically it could possibly be 4.45 meters. You can see there, 4.41 meters. So yeah, probably 4.45 meters if we did stretch it out fully and if it wasn't cut off right at the base. So I'm quite happy with that. Decent growth. Nothing record breaking, but as I say, last year was pretty good growing conditions, so I think that's why we got that extra tall growth from that bit. So that's all the canes from that archway. And then this archway over here, see, it's looking a lot better now. We got all these canes as well. So a huge amount of willows come off. As I say, very useful material. And this is how the archway now looks. Didn't do any extra weaving this year, but I might do some more weaving next year. The general structure is pretty good because I've been doing this for a few years now, so I'm quite happy with how it looks. So that'll look nice and neat. What tends to happen is it bushes up and you have a really green bushy archway until around May or June, and then from then onwards it's just a really tall amount of growth at the top half. So coming around, I'll show you all the rest of the canes as well. These are the ones you saw previously. This is the vast majority of the willow cane. So you can see here, this is 2-year growth. We got some really quite thick ones this year, thicker than normal. You can see there. I'm 6'4", so not very good for scale, but this is thicker than my wrist anyway. Really thick canes. You can really see the 2 years growth. You got 1 year to here and then the second year to there, just the 2 growth rings. So very fast growth. These will all be over 4 meters in length, some of them probably 5 or 6 meters, although they don't put on much growth after the first year. First year they get the height, second year, as I say, they put the side branches on. But some of those side branches, when they do grow up at the top, you can see this one here, for example, it puts on an extra 1 or 2 of growth. Now I will get a lot of catkins off these as well, not much off the first year growth from the archways, but all the second year growth, there'll be loads of catkins growing on them. We can take this inside, have it as a bit of an ornament in the house, which is always nice. And then there's all this material as well. So a huge amount of willow, as I say, lots of material has come up, it always does every year, and it always looks quite bare, and I can't imagine that this will be as bushy as it was at the beginning of this video in just a year's time, but it will be. That's how much material we take off every year, and it just all grows back again and looks very bushy in just a year's time. So that's all for this video. Hopefully you found it interesting. That's my annual willow update, and I'll see you guys again next year when I continue with the the willow pruning, and I'll try and keep this updated every year, so you can see how it progresses. Generally, there's not much change every year. Each year we seem to be getting a little bit more willow off the plants, but I think that's going to plateau soon because these are quite mature trees. And the archways are well established now, so I don't expect much change with them. But maybe next year I can put in a bit more weaving of the new branches and things like that. So that's all for now. I'll see you guys in a year's time with my willow update.